Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or good in the middle of the night, wherever you are. My name is Paul Timmers, and we are here for a session that is called Ready for a Crisis, Accelerated Digitization in Education. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me that I can moderate this session. I hope that our participants are able to join. I will start off with a short introduction, and what we will then do is we will have our speakers addressing a question and talking about about their question for, say, about 10 minutes, with other speakers being able to react to that. And then after we have had our speakers, we will also be able to address questions that are coming from you as participants. And I do hope and invite you to post questions as much as you can, and we'll pass them on here to the speakers and hopefully get into an interesting debate. We are tonight with three speakers. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Michael Gallagher, couldn't participate for health problems in the family. And when you're watching this, you may be seeing two speakers, not three speakers, because one speaker is still going to be joining when that's Felix Seyfarth, gets his connection right. But nevertheless, of course, we start this session and we go ahead about accelerated digitalization in education. Now, one of the notable effects of the corona-related confinement measures that we all were confronted with was, of course, the introduction of this emergency measures that had to be taken for remote education. And really in record time, education actually moved online. That came along with a plethora of tools, and I'm pretty sure that all of you have been confronted with many different tools online, and perhaps the tool that you are using today is yet another one. I didn't use this one before. It's also a very interesting one. But along with that also came concerns about data protection and about online safety and other perhaps even more complicated issues that we may be addressing here about control and surveillance. Few educational organizations were actually ready to make then a consolidated assessment of the reliability of the options, because they may not have had the time under pressure or not have had the insight or the means. The whole sector, in fact, of education is in a constant flux, and that has been accelerated by the COVID crisis. And it's very hard for many of the professionals to keep up with all of these developments, especially the technological developments that have come in great force. And therefore, we have already seen over recent years an interest in kind of revolutionizing education from the technology sector and promising to radically improve learning. Not everybody will necessarily accept that that is an improvement. There will be debate about that. So this panel is about a number of themes. What did the corona crisis do to education, in particular digital education? How would you then need to look at these technology platforms, these EdTech platforms, educational technology platforms, from these various aspects that I just mentioned? And then also, how does privacy function as a power in education? And we will certainly also be looking forward. What is the future of digital education, and what can we expect? What can we think of? So, what we will be doing now is I will invite, I think Felix is probably not yet online, so we'll improvise a little bit and change a little bit the order and start with Alexandra, who has a very interesting profile, Alexandra Giannopoulou. Alexandra, very welcome. Carrie, very welcome. I should have said that, and of course, welcome to everybody. Carrie is a postdoc researcher at the Blockchain and Society Policy Lab at the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam, and also an associate researcher at CNRS, Center for Internet and Society in Paris. Her research focuses very much on privacy and data protection, on digital identity, and on decentralization. And the question that we have which I would like to see that Alexandra addresses that, and then later perhaps also Carrie wants to react to that, is this question of how do you actually look at these tech platforms? How could you evaluate them? So Alexandra, I give the floor to you.
Hi, and thank you. Thank you for this question. I think that it's important to first highlight that so I'm sorry, I hear the second sound behind me. So it's important to highlight that this rapid shift to digital platforms for our education as a response to the pandemic has also unveiled this critical weakness in our educational system, which is the lack of adequate and secure digital infrastructure to support this urgent need. And so naturally, the evaluation of these platforms needs to take place with a multi-pronged approach. So not only a purely legal compliance exercise that we as data protection lawyers would be more inclined to do, but when we actually try to do that with some researchers, colleagues from different universities all over Europe, we decided that the answer to this shortcomings that we unveiled was much more complicated than this simple identification of the risks that these platforms maintain in terms of data protection and privacy. In our we studied some of the most prominent ones. Even the selection was a bit strange because we had to decide according to how different universities also responded to the crisis. So was it a top-down decision-making to impose one platform, or was it this multiplicity of tools? And what is the culture around digital education in different institutions? So we unveiled a series of failures to sufficiently protect data protection, to ensure data protection principles such as the purpose limitation or transparency requirements to give data subjects the sufficient tools to exercise the data protection rights. And also, this research also coincided with the case law and the extra EU transfers, and so we realized that while a lot of these platforms were relying on the existing provisions about the extra EU transfers of personal data, that was not the case anymore. So this added a lot more questions to this already problematic relationship. And this, while this was in everyone's eyes deemed as not so significant at the moment, in the sense that it was an emergency response to this very urgent crisis, we see now that this is a problem that persists and needs to be addressed in a more systematic way by each university, but also on a more national European level in terms of digital education principles and values. I could go on.
Yeah. So yeah, you have take your time, Alexandra. I mean, you can easily go on for another 5 to 6 minutes if you want to, because we would like to hear more of you.
Yeah. Then okay, great. I will continue. So how do we evaluate these platforms if not by pure this legal compliance means? Then I think it's important that the universities and these third-party actors actually work together to be able to embed by design the privacy and data protection principles as a precondition to use these services. Also, we have also put forward the idea that maybe in the medium and long term, national data protection authorities would actually address this systematic turn towards platforms for digital education and provide recommendations or some baseline principles, or simply scrutinize these services or the most prominent ones. In general, I believe that maintaining this persistent channel of collaboration with national DPAs when it comes to higher educational institutions is very important, because one of the most prominent questions that was rising during our research, but in general, talking with other fellow academics and students that are very much affected in their everyday lives while studying or teaching, or simply doing their research, is who gets to decide which platform we use and for what purposes. So I think it could be important to ask those questions in a more systematic way and to find a way to include at the negotiating table both representations of students and teacher bodies that would actually have a say in how their teaching or studying has been affected by these platforms, to negotiate better terms, and also consider all the maybe the coalition of universities could even be created to establish some minimum criteria for data protection and privacy principles, but not only, or to help get better negotiating conditions with these platforms, because one thing that we should also consider is that these platforms comes as an take it or leave it deal. So it's very hard, especially in terms of their privacy policies, to have a university try to enforce their own already existing principles and values into that platform. So I think it is very important to consider how the universities could actually get a better negotiating position vis-a-vis these platforms. I think that, and I would like to close with two specific issues that have not been highlighted enough, I believe, during this discussion about data protection in digital education. One is the fact that educational principles and educational systems are very diverse over the world. So while we go for this platformized education, which means that we will have this educational monoculture imposed using the same tools, with the same principles, with the same terms of use, more or less, that means that this diversity might actually be swept over by this globalization in digital education. And I think it is important to be able to cater to the needs, to the specific needs of either the universities or the region of the world that these platforms are actually used for. And of course, finally, consider whether we want to create our own in-house educational infrastructures, which of course comes with its own set of problems and responsibilities, but at least it would mean that we can, by design, create a platform that depicts not only our data protection and privacy obligations, but also the cultural and political choices of each university, as well as the ethical choices that this university chooses to implement, both in their physical and digital education.
Thank you, Alexandra. I mean, that's a very good kind of gives us a feeling of what is happening right now. Perhaps it's just a question for clarification. In your research, I guess you are making difference, or you differentiate different types of platforms, the purposes for which these platforms are used. Can you say a little bit about the categories of platforms that you have been looking at?
Well, we took into consideration two types of platforms, right? So we took into consideration the generalistic platforms. For instance, you see a lot of time that you would take some of Google's products, but use it specifically to deliver a teaching obligation, or using many platforms that were not built for the reason of delivering educational services. That were built on a completely different business model, such as, for instance, case in point, Zoom. But they have now been imposed as this de facto platform on which we deliver all our teaching, or do all our business meetings. And then we had the more specific platforms that were either specific to education, or they were either some there were some niche platforms operating on and serving completely different communities that were repurposed for their because of their capacity, and they were repurposed to serve educational needs. And of course, reading through these different privacy policies was a very particular exercise, especially when it comes to these generalistic platforms, because it is very hard to find this educational purpose in the different data processing that takes place in these platforms. And of course, none of these principles seem actually depicted in their privacy policies. Anything from data minimization to transparency was very much hard to find in those.
Yeah. And there is one question that of which I take the liberty to take half of it. There was a question by Marco about who decides what platforms to use, and can schools reject free laptops and software? Let's only take the first part of that question. So if you look at, hi Felix, I see that you have also arrived. Welcome. I'll introduce you in a minute. But Alexandra, first, simply for clarification of what you're talking about. So what did you find? Who is deciding on the platforms?
Well, this was very much a diverse approach, depending on which country we looked at and which university we looked at. So, for instance, the universities that would have been already prepared with some sort of digital infrastructure, they had more EdTech-specific tools, and they just simply expanded the service of these tools and purchased some extra licenses for some more general platforms. However, there were universities that had zero provisions about any sort of digital education. And so they either chose the most prominent actors, or they actually left teachers to their own devices to simply choose whichever service they found more suited to deliver the emergency teaching. And this has just become this norm since then.
Yeah, that's clear. I think Felix could perhaps not follow quite Alexandra's presentation, but perhaps Carrie did, and perhaps Carrie, in a minute, can you just, when you hear Alexandra, what is your type of 1 minute reaction to what she's saying?
My 1 minute reaction is that it's a great entree into what I was going to talk about, because there are many things she touched on that, and I'll be speaking about this in a moment, related to sort of how we view privacy and power. And so thinking about who gets to decide, and then this idea of a monoculture or globalization, and how that can serve to sort of, whitewash, for lack of a better word, or sort of norm things without taking into the local context, consideration of local context that is so sort of central to issues of privacy and power and the use of technology. So there are many things there that I'm excited to sort of think through in my own work, and then as we talk further.
Okay, that's you're doing a great teaser here. Carrie, I mean, that is watch this space. So on purpose, I will not now give the floor to you, Carrie, but first go to Felix, so people know that they also need to stay for hearing the rest of what you were just saying. So thanks a lot, Felix, for also arriving here. You had a bit of difficulty signing in, but very welcome to be in this session too, Felix Seyfarth. Before I introduce him, I should actually have said right in the beginning that I'm only the moderator here, but this whole session has been organized by Marco Huben, Ine van Zeeland, and Jo Pearson of the VUB, the Free University in Brussels. So thank you very much for doing this and having established also all of these contexts and the preparation for that. It's a super important theme. So I think you're spot on in what is concerning people right now. Now to Felix. Felix Seyfarth is a higher education researcher, lecturer, and consultant. He has a degree in political science at the Freie Universität Berlin. He was also a MOOC producer and a senior fellow in digital learning at the University of St. Gallen. His research is on organizational strategy and digital education formats, and that is about the interplay of technology-enhanced learning and organizational practices in higher education institutions. the Felix, how we do this is kind of, you have got, say, some 10 minutes to make your points. But that starts off with a question from my side, and I hope you can answer that in your presentation then. So really, we are interested in getting a reflection on what has the Corona crisis done to digital education. Felix, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think it most remarkable, looking back over the past 9-12 months, that very little has changed in terms of technological innovation. We are using tools that were available inside universities or in their environment, just as they have been for not just the past, but many years in the past. But the quality of discourse and the practices, as I'm sure you're all familiar, have undergone what I would call a quantum leap. It is now not a question of how and whether digitally aided distance learning is possible in higher education. It is now a matter of how will we continue these practices when we are not forced to by a public health situation and a pandemic. I can relate to the point that Alexandra has made, that in many organizations that we see in the German, Swiss, Austrian context where I am most active, some default standards have been imposed out of a sort of quick emergency, quick fix situation. These standards are now increasingly likely to develop continuity. And to the point that was raised earlier, this is on the one side coming from the demand. Universities need to teach, they need to mentor, they need to examine. But if we take the opposite perspective on the supply side, and if we look at what's actually available by different providers, be they commercial or open source or otherwise, we see that there's also a limitation. As a matter of fact, those universities that look for alternatives to a de facto standard of Microsoft Teams or Zoom or whatever they may be using find that the landscape of possible alternative solutions is very, very limited, and many of these products have never been developed or have trouble adapting to the higher education use case, partly in fact due to the fact that in the past this market of digital solutions for higher education has been very complicated. Local, regional, cultural specificities and contexts matter. This is something that many software providers have difficulty accommodating. The fact that higher education practices are very much embedded in institutionalized higher education systems and do not rapidly, thankfully, do not rapidly converge around technological digital standards, and as Alexandra especially has highlighted, to legal and juridical regulatory standards. So there is, I believe, on the technological, if we foreground the technological aspect of the change we've seen, a real risk that the plurality of teaching practices, of learning practices, of the dialogue between different disciplines, different kinds of higher education institutions and systems, to be normalized by an uncritical adoption of certain technological standards. It brings to mind, if we look at the large players in this market, and I want to emphasize, on the one hand, I don't mean to belittle this at all. I think it's a remarkable technological feat, both on the provider side and on the institutional side, to assure continuity from March 2020 on, and to not have to completely shut down teaching and research practices. So that's a big accomplishment and a big asset, and to be able to support staff on the administrative, on the research, on the teaching side in transferring their practices to an online and distance environment. That is a feat that I think many would have doubted possible in such a short time, as little as a year ago. Yet, if we look at the actual market situation, it lets the antitrust and anti-monopoly legislation and lawsuits from about 10 and 20 years ago in Europe and in the United States pale, because what we see is actually that the number of players and their penetration of crucial services that universities and that higher education needs for continuity in the future is very much that of a monopoly.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, is that? Do you think that that is actually perhaps hampering this innovation that you were wondering about?
Well, the obstacles and hurdles that I see, part of the problem is if you ask an institutional sociologist this question, he will give you an institutional sociological answer. So yes, I see the obstacles not in a lack of innovation bottom up. This happens both on the technology side, from the magnitude of different systems and solutions that we know exist. It also happens in individual teaching and research and administrative practices in universities. But the organizational structures that make the market for large-scale software solutions, hardware solutions as well, on a scale that is applicable to an entire organization, to an entire region, or to an entire educational system, that is a very difficult technological feat to then supply services in the necessary quality. And the same is true for institutional practices on the higher education side. You can very easily implement something innovative and effective and pedagogically valuable in your classroom or in your research practice, but to get it adopted as a standard either in your chosen academic field or in your home institution is a different, lengthy, and very complicated process, and that is quite frankly also out of the scope of what an individual instructor or researcher is able to do. But it's not really what they should be and want to be focused on. And so this is where I see there's a little bit of a gap in ownership. In responsibility, because in many, especially larger higher education institutions, this kind of strategic perspective, both inside the university and then also in a regional, supra-regional perspective of partnership, of standards, of acceptable and validated practice. This is, in many organizations, it's an area that does not have clear ownership and responsibility, and where also standards of quality are not easily available and need to be formalized and developed in a discursive manner, and much more rapidly now than it has usually been the case.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps one more question about, say, the way you looked at what you found in your research. You said you mainly looked at the Germanophonic market, at Germany, Switzerland, Austria, I guess. Is it for you possible to say, is there a big difference with other countries? What is the comparability, or you don't have those data available?
Well, it's I have scoured the comparative higher education literature to the point that I would sum up the state of research there in the sense that while we see higher education systems become more similar in their sort of official structures. Yeah? If you think of the ECTS system, the Bologna reforms, there's a lot of world systems research that shows that to achieve higher education legitimacy in almost all countries around the world, certain standards are at least symbolically adhered to because they define what in a modern nation higher education is. But the flip side of this is that on the actual day-to-day practice level, higher education system continue and probably increase to be more context-bound than ever before, because they address societal environment, a labor market, a political situation, financing models. It's the whole list of influencing factors that are very much bound up with the socio-cultural contingencies of their respective usually national, or as is the case in Germany and in Switzerland, also in Austria, a strongly federal system where particularities are addressed on a subnational level, and the normalizing influence of the federal government is actually quite circumscribed.
Yeah, interesting. Perhaps I can ask Alexandra and Carrie to kind of just give their 30-second, 1 minute type of reflection when they listen to Felix. What would you kind of comment or add to that? Perhaps Carrie first.
Sure. So again, nice entree into some of the things I'm going to be talking to. You can see why Marco and Ina brought us all together today. But I do think, to Felix's point about the siloed nature of higher education organizations, it is very difficult to get any innovation or technology. As you said, it can work great in a classroom. Whether that's going to actually be implemented across an institution or an organization is a very challenging thing. And I think the other issue that I'm going to talk more about is sort of the affordances of different technologies and sort of what's driving the use of that technology. Is it pedagogically driven or is it technologically driven? And arguing for that we should have a pedagogically driven use of technology, not the other way around. So as Felix said, making sure that we're using technology to support appropriate teaching and learning strategies, as opposed to having whatever the technology affords drive what we're teaching and learning.
Perhaps that also brings us to something we may discuss later on, the issue of inclusion. Alexandra, from your side, you kind of short commentary to this?
Yes. So what I was while I was listening to you, I think that what came up mostly from your speech to me is the fact that the difference in power dynamics between different institutions and the monopoly platforms that are out there right now available. So I think that certainly the lack of bottom-up different infrastructures, open source, more collaborative and inclusive in the way that they are built, is a big shortcoming in the market for many different reasons. But it also highlights the fact that the different institutions, depending on their power, will have a different impact in this platform market, right? So the smaller institutions that might have a different also cultural approach and social and political approach, like you very well highlighted, in terms of their education and within their specific social contexts, they might have less influence or less decision making when it comes to how they turn to digital education and which platforms to use, while bigger institutions will actually make more informed choices, but also might actually impose a standard that should not be a standard for all the institutions within the similar area, because specifically of this diversity in cultures and what they represent.
We'll get back to that, I think. And I see also that there are some questions coming in the chat, which we will pick up for the participants. We will pick up the questions after the contribution from Carrie. Well, I've informally the whole time said Carrie, but I never actually properly introduced Carrie Klein. So I'll do that now, and we'll move to her somewhat longer contribution. So Dr. Carrie Klein is a senior fellow at the Future of Privacy Forum. She works with K-12 and post-secondary education stakeholders to improve data privacy policies and practices. Her research is focused on the organizational and individual implications of post-secondary data privacy policies and on the influences of analytics and surveillance technologies on higher education, organizational and decision-making, on outcomes and on equity. She's also an affiliate faculty member in the higher education program at George Mason University, where she teaches social justice-based courses on organizational theory and student affairs. Carrie, impressive work that you have been doing. And a very interesting question that is kind of the kickoff for your presentation or your contribution here. You can take 8 to 10 minutes or so for that, which is about privacy as a form of power in schools. What can you say about that? And you also did some research into that. So Carrie, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. And thanks for that kind introduction. It's great to be here with you and with Alexandra and Felix today. So, as we've discussed today in US, Europe, and elsewhere, over the past year, educators and others have gone to Herculean efforts to ensure that learning can continue in a variety of forms during a global pandemic. The shifts have meant that we've needed to really take a hard look at what technology and the processes that associated with the shift works well and what could be improved. I think if we think of privacy, not just about protection of students and their data, but as a lever of power, it's also important that we start thinking about who the actors are in the space, how power is shared or not shared, and who has access to power or not. And to Alexandra's point, who gets to decide, who's the decision maker in these processes. So historically, we've seen a power-laden dynamic between the state and the individual related to privacy, right? But with the advent of modern innovations like those used to combat the pandemic and continue learning, that has added another another lever to the privacy and power dynamic. So that's technological space. So the use of socio-technical systems like those used often in teaching and learning environments, and then also other technology systems, EdTech conferencing, surveillance technology, and others, contact tracing technologies. These technologies and their corporations are increasingly knowing more and more about societies and their individuals, to include teachers and students. And with the advent of a knowledge-based economy, and we talked a little bit about market, or Felix talked a little bit about market, on top of that, access to control over data has become increasingly important in a variety of sectors, to include higher education. So more and more actors are entering the educational tech market, seeing an opportunity to support educational efforts while at the same time gaining access to data to help improve their products, right? And to improve their bottom line and the bottom line for their stakeholders. And this was happening well before the pandemic, as Felix also mentioned. Tech has been around and has been developing for a while. In US higher education, advising and learning analytics, that's big data about learners and their environments. These platforms have proliferated, across campuses in the last few years. And this was magnified during the pandemic, as both Felix and Alexandra mentioned, with the quick adoption of various technologies to make remote learning possible, from conference tech to surveillance tech to contact tracing tech. This has meant greater reliance on technology and platforms, more surveillance and monitoring of students in their environments, particularly their home environments, than we've ever had before, and more diverse collection of student data than ever before by institutions and technology corporations, especially for considering health-related data that may have been tracked by higher education organizations with return to campus measures. So these technology deployments and data collections have occurred with a varied privacy guardrails for their use, especially in higher education. So not only, in the States are we living in the Wild West to some extent, but higher education especially is in the Wild West of EdTech use when it comes to data privacy policies and protections being unified. And there's an argument there and a balance, right, between ensuring that you have proper, appropriate safeguards in place that meet the needs and sort of basic privacy needs, but that also are contextualized to the very diverse higher education context that exists both within and beyond the United States. And so ensuring that we have sort of that balance of standards and contextual understanding is really, really important. But with the use of these varied guardrails and with the sort of explosive sort of data gathering that's happened over the last 15 to 20 years, has also come some potential for harm. And we know from history and from the literature that increased surveillance and tracking disproportionately impact students from lower socioeconomic statuses, from historically marginalized population groups. So Black students, immigrant students, people of color, disabled students, typically are monitored and tracked more through surveillance technologies, which were used in part in the pandemic to deliver learning or test taking. than from other groups. So some of the harms from these included reports of proctoring technologies not recognizing students of color as people, which is a problem, clearly, of technologies recording students' home environments or facial expressions, of difficulty accessing technology by students or technology that's not disability compliant. So for American Disabilities Act here. And in one extreme case in Florida of having students' data being used to predict their potential for future criminal behavior in a very sort of dystopian way. These are just some of the ways in which privacy and power are intersecting in the ed tech space. And particularly for that Florida example, gives new meaning to Sarah Ego, who wrote The Known Citizen, that conception of a digital records prison. So it's really important that we're careful of how we understand the importance of privacy and power as it relates to the student space and the use of student data. So in most cases, students and their families are minimally aware of what's being collected about them, how their data is being used, impact them long term, or who even owns the data that they are producing for institutions or educational technology. And it's a clear example of the power differential that exists there. And to be clear, there is great potential, as Felix mentioned, great potential for the use of data and technology to transform educational and individual outcomes. Certainly without innovative technologies and partnerships between educational institutions and corporations, the shift in teaching and learning we experienced this past fall would have been far more difficult. And data can help schools and higher education institutions more easily see trends in teaching and learning, and to assist with data-informed decision-making, and to provide needed support to students to improve their outcomes and opportunities. However, as with most innovations, the appropriate policies and practices to govern those often lag behind the innovation itself. And they often do not explicitly address some of the inherent power dynamics at play, or the needed ethics or equity measures to mediate that dynamic. So if we're to support the idea of a universal right to education, and if we view education as an emancipatory process, as Freire argues we should, and if we are committed to an ethic of care for our students, which is a basic tenet of education, as Paul Prinsloo and Sharon Slade, who are learning analytics researchers, would argue, they've argued, that care needs to extend to the use of their data. And so again, it's this idea of negotiating the power dynamic that Alexandra mentioned. So really start having conversation it's about who gets to decide and where does power reside. So to even that power imbalance that can occur between an institution and an individual and the data and technology that's increasingly mediating that relationship, I would argue that we need to pay attention to a few key areas. First is policy. And so policy, and again, highly contextual, like many other things that we're talking about. But regardless of where you live or what your policies are, needed are policies that address the modern notion of data and technology and its use in education. So certainly there's been work on this via GDPR in Europe, and in the US, we have a patchwork of state laws. We have the FERPA regulations, which are around student record data protections, and various institutional data policies. But these policies often do not address modern conceptions and uses of data or the privacy-related power dynamics that exist. In work that I've done with Dr. Michael Brown at Iowa State University on institutional privacy policies in US higher education institutions, we found that they employ a narrow view of privacy protections to align with FERPA, often conceptualize data as merely a student record, nothing more, and are limited in their usefulness for informing students of their rights related to collection and use of their data. So really policies need to go beyond this to protect, beyond sort of just mere protections of student records, but must include clearly stated and communicated guidelines for collection, use, retention, destruction, and ownership of modern data, understanding that data are vast, able to be recombined and repurposed for a variety of efforts, and communicating those uses to students. We argue that in that work that we need to minimize the potential for harm or digital redlining of marginalized populations, that these policies must also align with Taylor's data justice principles. And we're providing students some level of control, basically, beyond notice and consent over their engagement with socio-technical systems and their representation by those systems and the right to be free from discrimination within those systems. And then secondly, per Alexandra, EdTech should be evaluated to ensure privacy protections are in place, that they're taking context, right? And to what Felix said before, that the technology is not driving the innovation. So from a power perspective, institution educators, technologists should consider whether pedagogy or the affordance of a technology is driving implementation of an innovation or collection of data. Simply stated, sound pedagogy should drive and technology should follow. So this is especially important when you think about those proctoring and surveillance technologies. You know, is that really the best use of a technology? Is that the best pedagogy to be driving, to be getting at student learning and development? Or is there another way around that? It doesn't necessarily require a proctoring mechanism. So again, if pedagogy is the driver and technology the mechanism, that can help. I realize I'm talking long and I'm running out of time. So the last thing I'll say very briefly is data privacy by design, but also data literacy training by design, that we really infuse this across different institutions, corporations, include students in the process. So it's woven into training and professional development for those who are creating, implementing, deploying, and protecting student data. And I'd argue that equity and ethical use of data should be a key point in all of those things. So I said a lot there very quickly, but happy to expand on anything or connect with anything else.
Yeah, but thank you very much, Carrie. I mean, it's great listening to you, and this is very, very insightful and also provocative on a number of points. Let me first ask Felix and Alexandra, listening to what Carrie brings here, how do you relate to that? Just your first kind of short reaction to that, Alexandra?
Yes, thank you, Carrie. This was very much on point, and exactly, I think we're aligned very well in our approach to this issue. First of all, thank you for incorporating in this discussion the issue of e-proctoring, which is also a sideline of the same discussion about edtech platforms, and what you said about the legality and the ethical values that should be considered when implementing such a process. I think it was very representative, the recent case that happened with the e-proctoring software in the Court of Amsterdam, where it was deemed that yes, it is this program is actually data protection compliant, but however, what authors have critiqued, questioned is exactly this ethical approach to, is this how we would like to continue this examination process through essentially surveillance programs driven and coordinated by the university. A second point I would like to also put forward with regards to the power relations that you highlighted is that stepping back a little bit and thinking what are these power relations in terms of the physical education environments, we see that there is a very clear articulation of relationships between the student, the teacher, the university, because there is a certain level of trust that we put that the institution, which is either our employer or the entity that delivers our education, has this high responsibility to ensure that it will take care of our personal data, it will collect only as much as needed, et cetera, et cetera. So this, we place this trust because we believe that the systems are accountable according to the data protection and privacy principles. However, now that we have new actors entering this relationship, all these trust relationships are very well shaken to the core, and this is why it is important, and this is why now we highlight so much it's important to reevaluate not only the decision-making processes, but also the responsibilities that are divided between all these different actors.
Yeah. How fascinating. Indeed, I want to come back to that in a minute, but first give Felix the chance to react to Carrie. Felix, I think your sound is not on.
When we were preparing the panel, we discussed how a good panel lives from controversy, and I've looked really hard, but unfortunately I find myself agreeing wholeheartedly with my fellow panelists. To Carrie's point, we have learned in research, I would say some 10 years ago, excuse me?
Go on, yeah, you can go on, yeah.
We've learned on the research side about 10 years ago that digitization is too important to be left to the IT department. We've learned this again, I would say some 5 years ago, in the with digital practice in higher education administration and strategic development, and we now have to relearn it again for especially teaching and learning. That with any technological implementation and practice, our first question should be on the quality of the learning and of the teaching experience. What does it do for outcomes? What does it do for pedagogy? How does it enable us to focus on those things that that are our main tasks, and not to become enthralled with a certain trend or tool or technology for the sake of it. It is never an end in itself. It is always a means to better educational practice. I think that is what I would call a bit of a mantra for all these changes that we're examining.
Yeah.
And I do think it's more problematic. We run a real risk of being divided and conquered, because by definition, teaching practice, instructional practice, and learning practice is decentralized, is pluralistic. It is anchored in disciplines, in departments, and with individual instructors, and that makes developing these kinds of standards, policies, guidelines, quality indicators that we're talking about more difficult than it does, for example, in research, which is the obvious contrast, where disciplinary governance and structures exist to develop this in a peer-reviewed mode, make it transparent. Similar practices for teaching and learning are yet to be established with the same kind of effectiveness.
Yeah. We will go to the questions that are coming into the chat in a minute, and I would also call upon the participants. Please do post your questions. But Felix, you provoked me because you said there's not enough controversy here. So let me put in some controversy. Isn't it actually really a good thing that we now have this crisis, and now companies are coming in like Zoom that are sitting on tens of billions of dollars, and they will start investing that in, obviously using data that they collect in the educational system to provide all kind of interesting added value services. Finally, education will improve, isn't it? So, Alexandra, do you agree?
Well, I have to at least throw a serious amount of caution. I think it is a valid point. Like I said, I do appreciate the quantum leap in institutional and also really on a national and global level that we've seen. There obviously is no turning back from this. As I like to say, we've all wished for digitization in higher education, not in this manner, obviously, but if we're looking at the results, I do think this is an immense progress. The difference is that universities, I believe, have lost the leading edge in this technological development. Yeah. When I was an graduate student, we were one of the few people that had an email account simply by membership in a university. And digital technologies were in universities because they were expensive and complicated and scarce. What we're seeing now is in the institution, we're trying to implement and develop policies, standards for data protection, for equity, for diversity. Meanwhile, our students, when they're outside their student role, throw their data to the wind often, sometimes in lieu of better knowledge, sometimes in lieu of alternatives. But the penetration of digital technologies in both private and professional industrial life has left universities a little bit in the dust, and we're playing a dangerous catch-up game.
Okay, that's a very good answer. I just want to have a quick check with the regie, because I believe that we would still have 15 minutes, or at least or 20 minutes. And yeah, that's correct. Yeah, just watching the timing. Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. There is a question here also then, again, related to this kind of perhaps controversy or power. Earlier, Marco asked the question: Can educational institutes refuse free software and hardware that is provided to them to entice them into, I guess, a certain system? So, kind of like saying, if you get anyway free laptops and free software, could you reject them in this type of crisis situation? Carrie, do you see that happening in the US? Is that a thing that is actually causing perhaps issues?
I don't know if that's happening in any institution in the US, that it'd be free unless it were in development. I mean, there have been examples of advising platforms that have partnered with universities in development and then taken the intellectual property and benefited from that intellectual property for their own corporations. And I think to Felix's point, I think universities are getting smarter about that, that if they partner with corporations to develop advising and learning platforms, they're starting to realize that they need a stake in the intellectual property so that they can also benefit from some of the financial rewards of that in the future. I would also say, you know, the old saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch. I think that, you know, there's some way that you're paying for the use of that technology. And while it may not be coming out of an institution's coffers, it may be coming from students and their data production. And so that's, again, where that issue of power and equity, making sure that you're paying attention to that and thinking through those things and sort of weighing the balances of benefits to students versus cost, benefits to the institution versus cost. And certainly as we move forward in this, because there are a lot of great examples of public and private partnerships in this space, but ensuring that the benefits, especially the financial benefits that may come from the production and use of data, are shared as well. And so especially for those public institutions, that they're getting some of those rewards as well.
Yeah. So in the world of social media, of course, we have seen that the free for all has led to what a number of people would consider dangerous or perhaps even disastrous situations on social media. And some people would argue now it's bound to happen again, because there we go, you know, big platforms are moving in with a lot of money, and it's no barrels hold. Is it a dystopian scenario like that, or would you not agree to that? You're talking optimistically about private-public partnerships. So, Carrie, what do you think?
Well, you know, Paul, that's a tough question for me to answer. It's been a tough month here in the United States. So, given your point, do I think it's all dystopian? No, I think that there are plenty of examples of really great public-private partnerships out there, and so. And that can act as examples and exemplars in this space. And I will say, even, you know, Zoom, we've all become very reliant on Zoom. I know in the classes that I teach, I teach over Zoom, and my institution has come reliant on that. And they've provided a service and, you know, and incorporated some feedback. And there were some initial problems early on with Zoom bombing and the like, but those have been remedied. I do think when it comes to social media, and that's an interesting space, right? Because it's a space of, you know, you get into free speech, and there are a lot of things that sort of get beyond the scope and sort of what are the issues of privacy. But that's where I think that's a space where if we start to really, you know, incorporate privacy education and civics education, so folks really understand the importance of civic engagement and education as a development of an informed citizenry that can engage and interact with information and data in an intelligent and in a critical and thinking critically about what they're interacting with, whether that's understanding the data that they're seeing or information that they're reading, or understanding how their own data are used. I think that's the space where I see a lot of room for growth and scholarship and hopefully movement, this is drawing up this time of a lot of uncertainty and sometimes hard spaces, drawing up a lot of opportunity for us to address some things that, again, have lagged beyond the advancement of the technology, and that we need to do some catching up. And it's bringing a lot of that to light.
Yeah, so links to an interesting debate that I think happened amongst others in the Financial Times, where it was signaled that to rescue perhaps even democracy, there really has to be this type of civic education that creates a mesotis, as Aristotle calls it, a critical middle group that doesn't drift off into the extremes. We can talk a little bit perhaps also about solutions, and that allows me to link also to some of the questions. Alexandra, I mean, you are in a sense perhaps providing ultimately a tool that allows people also to do evaluation of ed tech. One question is am I correct about that? And the other question is, within that links to a question that we got from, let me see, from Laurentiu, recommendations like from data protection authorities, and here a specific reference is made to the Dutch Data Protection Authority. Are they actually applicable in practice? Can schools handle that, this type of privacy compliance efforts? So, and does perhaps also the work that you do help to find people solutions in that direction?
Well, yeah, first of all, to say I wouldn't, I think that calling our proposals a tool is a bit of a, jumping a bit forward. We simply started this debate and offered some short-term and mid-term and long-term solutions or evaluation criteria that we think would be interesting. So to come back to the question, I think that leaving schools aside, so we essentially focused our research efforts on higher educational institutions for a variety of reasons, because I think also the schools would require a different set of considerations, and they cannot be homogenized with higher educational institutions. But if that term, I think that for that specific space, I think that there is enough infrastructure, interest, and also quality in place of the actors that are involved to actually request and receive and discuss these considerations in terms of data protection and privacy. So I think that the active involvement of DPAs is very valuable in terms of digital education, or even a more coordinated approach from an EU level perspective with digital education plans, etc. But also having data protection experts highlight these issues to educate further the administrations that would be in charge of making these decisions for now, or suscitating this debate about including more of the interested parties in this discussion. So I think yes, it's a big consideration for edtech platforms, and data protection does play a significant role in this discussion.
Yeah, and you are making an interesting link to what, for example, the European Commission can do with the Digital Education Action Plan, and play an active role in that, in which privacy issues and I guess also educational sovereignty issues play a role. Talking again a little bit more about solutions, question for perhaps Carrie and Felix. There is a question on the chat, or a comment actually, first of all, by Janice W. Congratulations on the super presentations to the presenters, so that's to you. And then a question about how do you actually kind of organize for example, data protection, but I guess more generally you could say that, how do you organize now best for this tech-driven type of change that is happening in the educational system? So what is the role of university management, data managers, staff, researchers? And I'm really thinking back actually to another field that I'm perhaps a bit more familiar with, which is the field of digital health, in which you now see studies appearing. There was a recent one by McKinsey that completely new roles are starting to appear, of people that are becoming data specialists, that are becoming organizational data specialists, that are becoming health data advisors. Not only, so the one question is, how do you see can things be organized? Who plays a role in that? Perhaps even also roles that are not yet fulfilled. Felix, at your side, how do you look at it within the systems that you know?
I'm very grateful for that point being raised, because this goes back to what we had started the discussion with, the context specificity of educational practice and educational systems, where we cannot simply expect technological tools and solutions to be implemented as singular standards, but where we need processes of curation, of critique, and of discursive development. I want to emphasize again the shift in discourse, where I believe there was a long skepticism in higher education when it came to digital technologies that had to do with the discourse of disruption. Will universities become superfluous? Will everything happen in with 10 institutions and about 5,000 MOOCs every year? Those fears, as we know now, were exaggerated. What universities do is more in demand than ever and is not easily replaced, and as far as I know, cannot be digitized or mediatized, as we have all painfully learned in the last year when we look at what we've lost being confined to digital practices only. So I look forward to this kind of dialogue that is sketched by this question, namely, we want to use these technologies, we have to become critical of them, and I think we are also in a good position now to make much more clear than we were able to before, to say what we expect, what we need, and what kind of standards we will not be undercut in the use of these technologies, to then constructively engage with developers, with companies, with regulators, and say, what are the kind of, I see the potential in technology, as it has in many other aspects of our life, to let us focus more on the substance of our work and to relieve us of the tedium, Xeroxing papers and distributing it to students, and asking them for money. I'm dating myself. These are ancient practices from the 20th century. So while focusing on the substance of our educational tasks, we also need to let the tech people, the industry, the regulators know what we require from them to increase the quality of this practice.
Yeah. And Carrie, at that organizational side, closely linked obviously to power, what would be your take?
Yeah, so some of the work we've done around learning analytics, I think there are sort of three main areas for faculty and advisors in particular, but folks generally in higher education organizations. So technologically, you need to make sure that whatever it is you're adopting can speak to other platforms on campus, because if it can't, it's really frustrating for anyone who's using technology to have 4 or 5 different screens up, negotiating between those screens, and to make sure your data are accurate. So your data are accurate, they're up to date, and that that you're relying on accurate data and data visualizations. Data visualizations can be really helpful and useful as well. But particularly for faculty, they want to know that the data they're receiving is accurate, and they also want to know what's behind it. So to the extent that you can, and oftentimes these are black box systems, but the extent you can, provide some sense making to faculty about sort of what data are composing the algorithms that are generating whatever predictive outcome might be out there if you're using a predictive analytics technology. Organizationally, having strong leadership, if you can find someone in a faculty group or an advisor group who is an early adopter and well respected and can act as sort of like not a salesman, that's not a great word, but can act as someone as an advocate for the program or for the technology, that's going to help get folks over the resistance of it takes time and energy away from my job to employ a new technology. So unless you can make it easy, tailored training for that person is also a really important aspect. So tailored training, make it clear and easy, get some stakeholders to help you out with that process. And finally, philosophical beliefs and values. That's where you get to the pedagogy piece for faculty, or disciplinary socialization issues. So tie it into socialization in your job, tie it into the pedagogical beliefs, use those as levers. And Austin has done some great work around this on different levers for engaging in faculty change in particular. And for students oftentimes will use tech because they're told they have to. But if you're using a predictive technology, oftentimes they are not going to listen to it if it tells them how it's going to limit their future, even if the data may be accurate, to say, hey, you shouldn't necessarily take that sociology 2 class because you didn't do so well in sociology 1. But if they are wanting to be sociologists, they're going to do it regardless. Our students were like, don't tell me what I can't do. I'm going to do whatever I want to do. But if you can do it toward potential, so using data, and again, this gets to power, right? So how are you using and communicating data so that it supports potential and positive outcomes versus limiting or constraining, especially when you get into equity issues? So those are sort of the areas I'd say are really important for organizations to consider.
Yeah. That's very, it's also very encouraging, because that's also a way forward. Yet, I don't want to end this panel on a negative note, but at the end, of course, they say the world turns around money. And there is actually a question about money, Felix, for you. Joe is making the point, several points, but let me just pick out one point, which is that, isn't it very hard for educational institutes, to universities, etc., higher education institutes, to come along, because actually they were faced with so many budget cuts, and perhaps over the past year, so they aren't really a player in this game. On the other hand, perhaps let me give a positive twist to it. Would you say that now that governments are investing so much money to recover from the crisis, especially the educational sector should jump onto that and say, hey, I've got something here that really deserves support now that all this money is being made available, finally?
I'm going to try and give a 1 or 2 minute answer to that.
Just a 1 minute, yes.
But this is, Carrie, if I take as a jumping off point what you just described, there is, again, it's a very different context in the European discourse, where education is largely publicly financed, and where I think part of why the technological market there is a bit underdeveloped is what you alluded to. That the budget is limited, but there's the flip side of this is that higher education in that sense is very much an investment. It is not a place to make money, but it is a place to invest for a future payoff that has to do with also training future generations in the technical skills, yes, but also in a critical reflection on these tools that will very much shape their lives and our future. So I cannot overemphasize this point that governments on the one side, but also students are well advised to take this part of their education and the educational investment, be it in money or in time and commitment, very seriously. It is they who will ultimately shape the practices that we use those tools with. And I do believe once we come out of the current crisis, to be ready for future problems that don't come in neat disciplinary packages. I mean, the past year has illustrated a point that we've known about for a long time. It has social, legal, technical, regulatory, medical implications, and we're going to need to be oriented in solving these problems together with the appropriate tools, not in the past discourse of disciplinary competition.
Yeah. Well, Felix, I think what you just said, that's actually a very nice way also to wrap up the panel, because it's clearly a vision and a moral duty that is and an ethical perspective that come into play here. I think with this, it's a really, really challenging topic, and I think lots of people have this feeling this really needs to be tackled, because that's, as you say, it's the future of our society, our democracy, our economies. It's the world that we want it to be, to tackle digitization in education, and especially in these changing times. So for me, that means I can wrap up by thanking actually the panel, thanking Alexandra, Carrie, Felix. Thank you very much for being present here. Once again, also thanks to Marco, Ina, and Joe for having organized this. I see there is a call for you can join a wrap-up session that happens with Paul de Hert, Annemie van Akkeren, and Rosa Wavers in the Forest Bar on Gathertown after this session. So you and all the participants are invited to go to that part of the Forest Bar in Gathertown. Once again, thank you very much, and I hope that we see a lot of fruit of your thoughts and your dedication. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.